Good morning, children. Today we're going to do what children do. We're going to play with a puzzle. But instead of putting the puzzle together like they do, we're going to take it apart because that's the kind of people we are. Here we go. The song is called Words to Say by a band called The Arrows from South Africa. They are fantastic, and I was lucky enough to be able to produce and mix their record. Today we're going to work a little differently because it would be virtually impossible to take this track from zero to finish in 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours or even 10 hours. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a guided tour through the insanity that is the mix of Words to Say. The first thing we should do is take a look at the version number of the mix. It says 1.8.1, which means that I mixed this song 8 times and then a little more. Why would I have to mix a song 8 times? It brings an interesting question. How long does it take to mix a song? Well, it depends on the song. Let's take a look at why it took me 8 attempts to get this to sound right. Let's listen to the song. And then it repeats. And then there's a really great bridge, which we'll play later. If you look at the Pro Tools mixer, I have my regular organization from left to right. Drums start at the left, and then bass, guitars, keyboards, vocals, background vocals, door slams, special effects, stemming, and then ancillary stuff. So let's look at the whole thing. So if you look to the left of the mixer, you see that I tend to put electronic drums all the way left. Here I have some sort of a tom fill, a Rhythm 77, which we'll look at in a minute, 3DMX sample, boom, and a cymbal crash, apparently. Then I go into real drums, which I put in green, 3 bass drums, so I have 3 bass drum microphones, then a sub, and then something in light blue that's electronic. We don't know what it is yet. We'll look into it. A top snare, apparently mic'd with a Horizon microphone, a hi-hat, pair of toms, printed toms, a tom reverb, then a bunch of rooms and cymbal microphones, which apparently I wasn't too enthused with since they're at 0. A drum bus, and then another drum bus with apparently a gnarly compressor on it, so that must be parallel compression. And then another one called parallel compression with distortion on it. That's going to sound interesting. Snare tail, another tail, a nonlinear reverb, which is probably a gate. Then we switch to bass in red, electric bass amp, electric bass DI, a sub for those 2, then a duplicated DI. I wonder where I did that for. We have to look into it. Some riff, and apparently it was new, because it says new riff. Then guitars, 1, 2, 3 guitars, which we tracked in Paris. The riff was tracked in Paris too. Electric guitar through an Avalon DI. More buses, reverbs, delays on the guitars, a delay through on the guitar, aha. And then in pink, of course, keyboards, MS-20s, some piano riff, another piano that was tracked in Paris. Reason was tracked in Paris. Expand, more piano that I added after, and then a bunch of little things that are supposed to sound pretty. A reverb for the keys, a delay for the keys, and then a whole bunch of vocals. 1, 2, 3, 4 lead vocals and a bus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different reverbs or echoes. Then another lead vocal here, low verse. Wonder what that does. Then a whole bunch of backgrounds, doubles, about 30 tracks of vocals total. And then reverbs for the backgrounds, delay for the backgrounds, and then the stemming, and then the printing. And that is why it took me 8 attempts to make this sound right. It's an enormous amount of tracks. Here's how I function when I mix these kinds of songs. Every track goes to a stem, either directly or via a bus. For example, if I look at the Rhythm 77 beatbox, that is going straight to E drum stem, electronic drum stem. But if you look at the 3 bass drums right here, first they go to a bass drum sub, so I can process the 3 of them together and give them glue, and then it goes to the bass drum stem. If you look to the right of my session right here, you have an electronic drum stem, a bass drum stem, a drum stem, a bass stem, guitar stem, key stem, lead stem, and background stem. The benefits of working this way are multiple and endless and wonderful. Let me show you. First, for example, say you want to listen to the verse with just the drums and the bass, nothing else. You don't have to go throughout the session and mute everything. You can just mute the stems you don't like this 4, and press play. Say you have weird taste, you want to hear just the bass drum and the vocal, you can mute everything but the bass drum and the vocal.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them.
Not super useful, but you can do it. Now, the point here is that everything being separated in little slices gives you the benefit of listening to whatever you want very quickly. Also, it lets you process groups of instruments together very quickly and very elegantly throughout the whole mix, as opposed to just at the end. So for example, if your client is going to play this record live but doesn't have a 25-piece band, easy. You say, what do you want? You want the bass drum separate, the drums separate, the bass separate? Here you go. Want the bass drum separate? Mute everything, record the bass drum. Mute that, record the bass. With all the processing perfectly aligned, perfectly in sync. Isn't that wonderful? Another benefit of working in stems like this is that you're ready to go for analog summing. If you pay attention, the output of every one of these buses is actually sent to a physical output of my interface. So you'll notice that the E drum stem goes to C12, bass drum stem C34, etc., until D18. Then that goes into my 2 bus. Then the output of my 2 bus is connected via the patch bay to the input of my liaison, and the output of my liaison is connected to the input of this aux right here, on which I have a couple plugins, and then I print that onto a track. If you want to know more about the analog summing proper, you should watch a video about that. But that's the principle. I have all my tracks going to stems. The output of the stems go to my 2 bus. The output of my 2 bus goes to my liaison, which I use to process or not process, depending on my taste that day. And then I print that. Make sense? If you're curious to know what I have on my 2 bus via the liaison, on insert 4, I have a Dangerous Bax EQ, and on insert 5, I have a Dangerous compressor. So that's all the hardware there is on this mix. No other hardware other, of course, than the Dangerous 2 bus. Let's start with drums. I'm going to mute everything else on the stems right here and scroll all the way to the left of the session and take a look at everything that's going on with drums. Let's start at the top of the song. And then it repeats. So we have nothing but acoustic drums for the first verse. Then on the second verse, we have some weird kind of like march coming in from an old beatbox. Then there's a pre-chorus. And then instead of going to the chorus, we go to another verse where the beatbox stays. Then another pre-chorus. The pre-chorus is the part where the hi-hat goes. And then we go into the chorus where everything comes on, where the DMX samples come on, and it sounds huge. So let's listen to all the parts separately and analyze why they sound the way they do. First, bass drum. The acoustic bass drum sounds like this by itself. You hear the bleed from the rest of the instruments, and that's the actual bass drum. There's 3 microphones. If I mute every plugin on the bass drum, it's going to sound like this. You have the inside bass drum microphone. Then you have the outside bass drum microphone. And then you have a sub microphone, one of those speaker deals. I see no time alignment plugin, which means that they are relatively in phase. If I start with just the inside microphone, so I have gates on the inside and outside microphone, probably because I thought that I was going to compress this a lot because it's modern and it's got to be in your face. And the bleed from the rest of the instruments would become a problem, so I put the gates. It sounds like this. Not going to change the course amount of music, but I may gain a couple dBs. Then I'm EQing the inside bass drum this way. Flat, with. You notice that I'm high passing very much, and I'm also cutting all the fat around 120 because it's a little woolly. And what I'm looking for from this bass drum microphone is the punch and the click, not the So I'm happy with this. Then if I add the second bass drum and I turn that EQ on, sounds like this. If I play it by itself, flat, but with the EQ, less cardboardy, you'll notice that the high pass is being tuned so that the two of them still feel in phase. Then on the second one, I'm adding a little bit of compression. I'll gate it first or expand it so I get rid of some of the ambience and some of the bleed from the other instruments. That allows me to then compress it to give it tone without raising the noise floor too much. So this is flat without the compression and with. Because of the compression action, it actually lengthens the bass drum a little bit, and the two of them together sound pretty cool. And then there's the sub. So the sub is EQ'd this way. You notice there's also a high pass in the same area so it doesn't get out of phase. It sounds like this. Without. With. Just a question of getting the phase together and a little bit of compression. Or no compression at all. This compressor could not be here, but it's here, so we're going to leave it. And the three of them together. So these three bass drum microphones are then summed into an aux that I call the submix, or sub for short. Not to be confused with the bass drum sub microphone, which is a speaker you put in front of the microphone. It's confusing, but let's not be confused. And that submix has some plugins on it. Why not put the plugins on here? I have found over time that the way I function is I get the three bass drum to work together, then I have this submix, and then I mix everything else. And then as other things evolve, I feel the need to enhance the bass drum sound again. And I can do that on all three microphones at once by processing the submix as opposed to processing the separate microphones. So for example, here I have another high pass, and then I have a little bit of compression, and then I have a Pultec Pro that gives me some 60 and some 200. So flat without these three plugins on the submix. And then with the three plugins on the submix. That is an obnoxious amount of gain, so it's difficult to hear before and after. Let's try and do that. Okay, that makes sense. Without all three. With. So it's fatter and more forward. I'm going to bring the gain back up to where it was, because if I don't, it's going to throw the whole mix off. But side note, this is really bad behavior. I sucked at this. I should always make sure that my pre and post plugin levels are more or less the same, so that when I bypass a plugin 3 months from now or a year from now, I can hear pre and post without ruining the mix and knowing exactly what the plugin is doing. I was just being lazy. One more thing on this bass drum that's unconventional. You may notice here something called nonlinear. This guy. That's a send, and it goes to a bus. And in that bus, there's a plugin. And that plugin is a nonlinear reverb. So this is the sound of the bass drum without the effect. With. Listen to the tail, just the end of the sound. It's not as abrupt. It's more extended, if you will. Again, without and then with. But didn't your mother tell you never to put reverb on bass drums because it makes a mess? Absolutely, and we don't care. In this particular case, I felt that the bass drum was disconnected from the rest of the mix, and too dry and too forward and didn't have any sauce. And I like my dishes with sauce, so there. Another trick I use here is I actually augmented the bass drum with a sample. I'm using trigger, and this is what the sample sounds like. Now you understand, since the regular bass drum sound sounds like this, that the sample helps with the part. That's a technical term. I'm going to raise the level of the sample so you can really make it out, and then I bring it back to a more metrosexual level. Here we go. So it punches. And that's what we need, because it's a big song with a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of bass drums, and they all want to be the one. And so this one helps this bass drum be the one. Here we go. So that's the beginning bass drum of the song. Here. The groove is based on the tom pattern, this tom pattern right here. Wait, that's not how it sounds in the sauce. How is that possible? Good question. Because I thought that this was a little small. Also, it rings a lot, which means that if I push it loud, it's going to make a bloody mess. More of a mess than the reverb on the bass drum for sure. So, not only do I try and augment it here with R bass, this is without R bass. Better, but not great. So what I did is actually ran the track through a MIDI detector and use a sampler, and I played a tom sample under it perfectly in phase. Check it out, this is the sample. With the direct sound. As a reminder, direct sound without the sample. Who votes for with sample? Who votes without sample? With sample, good choice. Here we go. Of course, it's a high tom too, so I sampled the high tom too, and the high tom only plays a couple times. We'll hear it when it comes in. And then I added some reverb on the sample only. Why that? Good question. Because if I add the reverb on the real tom, the reverb is going to be on everything. The snare bleed and the high tom bleed and the hi-hat bleed and everything is going to make a mess. Even more of a mess than the reverb on the bass drum. So I put the reverb just on the sample tom. It sounds like this. So I'm high passing the send to the reverb so that the reverb doesn't get excited by the whole sample. And then I'm using this digital reverb that sounds a little bit like a 250 in the sauce of all the drums. Notice what happens if I mute the reverb. Watch it. I'll start with and then I'll mute it. If you mute the reverb, everything feels kind of lonely in its own corner. If you add the reverb, it creates a sauce in the back of the track that sounds like family because it is generated by elements of the track. It's better than a pad, and it kind of acts like a pad for the drums. Side note, the snare drum microphone is also responsible for a good part of the tom sound. Check it out. This is just the snare microphone. Notice there's no compressor on that track. The reason why there's no compressor on that track is because if I compress the snare, it would also compress everything in that track, which would bring the level of the tom up. And we don't want that because we like the tom sound. So it's a compromise. But there are ways to go around that, which we'll see in a minute. Quickly, the overheads sound like this. They're not crucial. Check it out. So they don't really change the sound of the drums. However, when it hits a cymbal, that helps. The overheads help because everything else is so close mic that I won't hear the cymbal very well in the other mics. So basically, those are still there just for the cymbals. We'll talk about cymbals in a minute. The mono kit and the cymbal mics, apparently I didn't like the sound of them because they're incredibly off. And then the drum room, same thing, is up. You notice no processing. It's just extra noise to create buoyancy and happiness and joy and things like that. All that stuff is being bussed into a drum bus that has a little bit of limiting on it. Notice that the snare excites it. I'll show you again. Just to keep the peaks on that snare down. All these drum tracks are sent to a bus that I call drum sub for submix, and I assigned that to an aux. I also use that bus to feed the parallel compression bus right here, on which I have my DBX 160. If I listen to just the direct drums without parallel compression, it sounds like this. If I listen to just the parallel compression, and I listen to the both of them, for reference, this is the parallel compression bus without the EQ or the DBX 160 or the limiter. And this is with all three of them. So I got lazy. I did not set another aux with another bus and have a different mix for my parallel compression. I basically took the same source as my direct clean bus for the drums, and I used that to crush them, and then I used the fader here to decide how much parallel compression I want to tuck on there. And apparently I wanted to talk about this much. Now the point here is the bass drum is nowhere near those two buses, the clean one or the parallel compression one, because I know that there's 80 or 90 tracks of stuff, and I know that the first thing that's going to collapse when I start putting everything together is the bass drum. And the last thing I want for this kind of music is to have to fight to keep the bass drum in the middle. Putting the bass drum in the parallel compression bus would make it a little fuzzier, a little more connected, and I have no control over that connection. So I decided to leave it alone, but to put reverb on it, remember? One more thing about the acoustic drums. There's this drum parallel track, which means that it was recorded with compression on it. So this is what it sounds like raw. Then the EQ high passes it to remove the thing. Then decapitator probably gives it bite. And then the DBX glues it together. In the sauce of everything. Without. Day after day, version after version, based on the feedback from the band and my own change of feelings on what I did the day before. It gets more and more complex and more layers get added. It's like a tree growing, and then you get there. If I started from scratch today, it would probably sound completely different. Maybe better, maybe worse, but definitely different. On the second verse, we have a guest. This is our guest. It's my old Roland Rhythm 77 preset beatbox, and I probably selected the March preset and tried to match the tempo, which it probably didn't, and then I recorded it into Pro Tools and I sliced it up, and then I matched the tempo, but it's still in March from a Rhythm 77 from 70s or 80s. The point here is a different texture, and it adds really nice layer and groove to the other drum set. Check it out. Even though this came out of a box that was designed to be put on top of your home organ so that you could entertain your guests and family when they visit from Ohio, in this particular case, it actually gives a bit of a gnarly vibe and manly vibe to the track. Check it out again. So, by itself, it sounds like this, completely raw. I then remove that thing with an EQ. Gave it a little bit of bite with the ubiquitous decapitator. And then gave it a space. Simple, repetitive, just what we needed. As a reminder, this track started as a demo that the Arrows did themselves in Durban, South Africa. Then we met in Paris, we travel a lot, and we worked together on it and came up with a bunch of tracks. Part of those tracks was a DMX sample that I liked, that I added because I felt it needed something on the chorus. The current drums at the time were some sample drums and they were not super happening. So now we have the DMX, but since then we've recorded the acoustic drums. So do we want to keep the DMX that we put there because we felt the chorus was not happening? Do we want to get rid of the DMX because the real drums are really happening? This is the chorus with the real drums, the DMX samples, and the Rhythm 77 March top of the organ family entertaining beatbox. And I forgot the boom pattern that we actually added in Paris too. Check it out. So, this was everything. Rhythm 77, DMX, boom, and acoustic drums. Without the Paris tracks, it sounds like this. Who votes for with the Paris drums? Who votes for without the Paris drums? With? Good choice. I like that we always vote the same. Processing-wise, boom is left alone. It's actually still playing from the SoftSynth plugin. We like the sound the way it was, left it that way. It does its trick. It's fantastic. The hi-hat, the DMX hi-hat, same thing. The DMX snare, Apparently it had a little ring at the bottom. Let's check it out. Without. With. Just a little shine and getting rid of the head cold. And then the bass drum, however, started like this. That's a bass drum for real, man. What happened here with the DMX is I probably soloed the real bass drum, played the DMX bass drum raw, and try and find spot where the DMX bass drum could fill what the real bass drum does. And the boom track too. So all three of them together with no EQ. With. So you'll notice that I'm using the DMX in the 200 and the 400 range, where it can be difficult to get a real bass drum to really hit, but a sample is really easy, right? So the sample is taking care of that where the real bass drum can't, and the real bass drum is getting the joy and the buoyancy and the humanity in it all. Then I'm adding even more of that with the SPL Transient Designer on the DMX. You notice that the sustain is down. What's that sustain thing? This is great because it lets you paint the length of the bass drum. Check it out. This is flat sustain. Now I can shorten it. If you notice, the effect of it on the entire bass drum is this. Without the DMX, super punchy. And then the Summit EQ is probably just to soften the transients. Let's listen to it in solo. So I was probably planning to use it for something else, enhance it and make it fatter. And then I forgot, or it didn't work for me. But then when I muted it, that tiny little thing it does, I felt a little bit of CD over it, so I decided to leave it instead of ruining the rest of the mix, because that's the kind of person I am. So that's our drum sound for the song. Let's listen to all this, now that you know how it's done, from the top. Etc. Let's turn the bass on and check it out. So the bass is made out of a bass that sounded like this at the beginning. Then a little bit of this EQ, looking for some 300 here. Okay. Without. So So basically, I know that the bass is not going to be fat enough to be the bass. So I'm using it as an ambassador for the bass, making it shine in the area where there's room and leaving the rest be. A little bit of compression. Adds a little fatness. Decapitator, because when you can, you should. And then tape head, because that's a different kind of distortion. So again, this is colors. So I probably put EQ on and the compressor on, then I added some other stuff and I said, I need a little bite. So I added decapitator. And then I was like, that's not enough bite. I tried to push it, I didn't like it. I said, what about tape head? So I put tape head on, remove decapitator. And I was like, I kind of like decapitator into tape head. Trying these kinds of things gives you ideas and lets you make happy mistakes. Then for the rest of your life, you will always use decapitator into tape head no matter what you do. That last EQ is probably there for the fact that you should probably not be using decapitator into tape head for everything until the rest of your life. Here we go. Then we have a duplicate of the DI and I've put a bunch of stuff on it. What's that for? Since I already have the DI there. So I'm doing parallel processing. The reality here is that this is just not enough. We have this guy here. The synth we recorded in Paris, if I mute it, it sounds like this. A little edge with Devil Lock and then a little fat. With the Pultec, this Pultec is always great if you want to add bottom to something. Couple clicks at 100, quite a few clicks at 200, and then Echo Boy for space. Without. With. That is a 16th note delay with feedback, but with a high-end cut on the return. So it's not a reverb, but it does give a tail. Again. Without. So it sounds less demo-y and less dry with a little bit of that tail. But still, this plus the regular bass is not enough. So I added a duplicate of the DI, which I crushed. This is how it sounds raw. So I see a little lab in between phase here. And if I listen together, flat without the in-between phase, that sounds pretty fat. If I activate the in-between phase, I think the answer is with the next plugin. This EQ here, I'm using as an extreme high pass because all I want is the buzz from the extra DI. The fat coming from the original sound composited of the amp and the DI. So if I activate the EQ that has a really high pass filter, this happens now. Without the little labs. So this little labs is here to compensate for the fact that I'm using an extreme high pass filter on that extra DI. And the fact that I use an extreme high pass filter kind of ruined the phase between the direct sound and this DI. And I use the little labs to compensate for that and shape the tone to my liking so I can use the DI just for high end and distortion without ruining the bottom. Make sense? Rewind. I'll wait. Distortion? Yeah. Compression? That compression is there for that line because otherwise it just sticks out. With just a little bit of stay power and then a little delay to give it space. This is flat with the delay. And now the three of them together. If you listen to just the synth we did in Paris and the bass we did in Paris, without the DI track, it sounds like this. With. And in the sauce of everything, without. And with. You need that DI to give focus in the middle and make sure that the bass is really anchored and never wavers. So that's the bass sound. That's pretty much it. Next is guitars. Most guitars on this track were recorded in Paris. There's this guy, which is basically exactly what we did. I only have a little bit of a cleanup at the bottom and a little bit of compression. Without, it sounds like this. With. We knew what we wanted and we did it well, so there's no need to torture this sound into something else. We just need to adjust it a little bit so it fits with the 800 other tracks. That's about it for this one, no big deal. The next one started as a DI recording straight into the box. Then we used the Waves guitar stomp to give a nice gnarly octave vibe. That was done during the recording session. This, and then 11 to give it more of a guitar vibe as opposed to a synth vibe. This really qualifies more as bass than guitar, but it's fun anyway. And then a little bit of a delay. Without the delay is like this. So the delay is all the way to the left. That way you get that spread thing. The two guitars together. And with the bass, basses. Awesome. And then there's one more guitar that comes in on the pre-chorus. I ran it through a synth filter in real time while I recorded it. So it started raw like this. There's a first EQ to give it presence. This is probably warranted just by the amount of stuff that's going on in the chorus. And then a little bit of the Neve vibe. I don't know why I have this on. Let's figure it out, with and without. There's a nice saturation. Without. Listen to the transient, the first attack, this. So without. And with. It's super subtle, but it will prevent it from sticking out of the track on that one hit in the subsequent hits. And it will give it a little bit of a softer, gentler sound in the sauce of everything. And then, reverb. Oof. That's this 250 there. I love this reverb. And then the same delay. That is awesome. And then after the Paris session, I added two more of filtered guitars that I think were interesting to double the line on the chorus that go like this. It's kind of the same vibe as what we did in Paris, guitar through synth filter, but they're stereo and they have delays and they help transition the end of the chorus and soften the exit of the chorus. Let's listen to all guitars plus drums plus bass on a verse, pre-chorus, chorus so you get the progression of the arrangement. Here we go. let's move on to synths. Keyboard-wise, in Paris, we did this. Which was really this. But obviously I needed to open it up because there's so much stuff going in the low mids. And then a little bit of filter for extra filter, because you can't have too many filters. So this is just opened up with the EQ. And then the Moog filter to give it more of a bite. And then we use Expand to do that 80s synthy kind of thing, which at the time sounded like this. Open it up. If you wonder why there's a big peak here, it's because there's a room in the track there. So I took advantage of it. And then Devil Lock, which is a great crush box. You can't listen at the same level pre and post with Devil Lock. It's a shame, but it doesn't matter because it's so good that I use it anyway. And then Echo Boy for space. Then there's the Reason thing. I played with it a little bit after the Paris session to give it some detail and cool little things, and then added some reverb and then some delay. The reverb is the 250 that I love, and then the delay is, you guessed it, Echo Boy. It's an 8th note delay, and it's high passed a little bit, and it's a really thin delay. It's the transmitter model. It sounds like this, just the delay. As a reminder, dry. So these little sequency part are always good to put a little bit of reverb. I like it because it gives height to the part. It also gives it a more grandiose vibe as opposed to just somebody going tigging, tigging, tigging on a keyboard. It gives this majestic quality to it. Check it out in the track. I'm going to play the same thing and mute reverb and delay every 2 bars so you get the vibe of what they do. So these are my reverb and delay right here. Here we go. We start with. It does this. And that's what we need. That's what the keyboards are for. So that's cool. Things I added post Paris session because nobody was watching. These. Because I own a piano and I could. Also use that on the verse. Somewhere, I think if I remember well, here on pre-chorus actually. So I really like the filter gate idea we did in Paris on the fake piano. So since I had a real piano mic'd up, I said, what would a filter gate sound like on a real piano? Well, it sounds like this. So the reason why it falls apart bitsy like this is because I have a gate on it with a fairly short release. And so the piano hits and then the gate tries to close it, but it doesn't quite know what to do and gives that thing to it, which makes it weird. And we love weird. Here we go. I also added some MS-20s on the verses to go with the choir that goes la, 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 la. It goes like this. Check it out. And then its little brother on the left. And the whole family. Played twice because we're not lazy. It's a puzzle. And here's another piece. Check it out. Here, at the end of the chorus, before the verse, it goes like this. What's that? That is a piano hit, which I reversed and cut up. And then I cut two little pieces out of it. So you hear the rise, and then the other two pieces go bump bump. And that's to create a transition with the verse. If I play the end of the chorus without this transition trick, it sounds like this. Boring. But if I add this little thingy, much better transition and a lot more fun. These days, we all make music with computers, which, let us not forget, were designed to do word processing and not music. And it shows. Now, the biggest problem with computers is the copy-paste function, which most of us think has a benefit, but it's not. The problem with copy-paste is that most of music has already been heard somewhere because it's a copy-paste. Also, copy-paste tend to be used from bar to bar, which means you copy a whole chorus. Which means that the transitions between every part is really forgotten because there's no real special transition copy-paste function in your word processor. So, it's very important as a producer or as a mixer to pay attention to your transitions. Otherwise, it sounds like word processing. Side note, I get asked the question a lot about where do I draw the line between production and mixing? Very good question. These days, it's blurry because of the word processing thing. Because you can do just about anything and add stuff and remove stuff. And it really depends on the ego of the producer if you're the mixer. Now, in this particular case, I was the producer. So I had a conversation with myself and I let myself do whatever I wanted for the mix. But it may not be that easy. Sometimes I don't let myself do what I want. Sometimes I had to fight myself to let myself do what I want, if you know what I mean. Yeah. So production and mixing at one point are going to completely merge. Some people basically mix the track while they produce it. And some people hire somebody to mix it. It's not that in stone. And that's the key. It's blurry. It moves. There's no dogma about it. And let's not have any dogma about it. Let's get back to transitions. We saw the piano one at the end of the first chorus. Before every chorus, you may not have noticed, but there's this little thing here. It's a tom fill. Check it out. So this was actually created for this song. It's not found sound. I had him play a tom fill because I felt maybe it'd be cool. Why? I don't know. Maybe I felt Tommy that day. Usually people do things like this. I'm sure I have one here. Check it out. This is cool too. This is a reverse cymbal. You can do this very simply. Drop a cymbal sample in your timeline, copy it, use the reverse function to turn it around, and then aim it so it feels good. Just tight on the beat. That plus the tom really help with the whole thing. Without, it just sits there. Those little details make the difference between interesting production that will bring new stuff to listen to the listener every single time, or just a flat track that just sits there because it was done in a hurry. Transitions don't always have to be something special. They can also be nothing special. For example, at the end of the first verse here, check it out. There's a hole that I just cut in with automation. The fact that there's a space there in a wall of sound makes it an interesting transition and makes it different from the other transitions in the song. That's your touch. Make sure you pepper little things like this here and there in the song, otherwise it just gets boring. It can also be cool to use special effects on existing tracks to create smoother transitions. I showed you earlier on the guitar that there's that extra line that comes down, has delay on it. And I use the same trick here on that If I Only Knew part. Check it out.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
So what's going on here? If we go and look at the tracks, there's 3 tracks saying, oh, if I only knew. And that's all buzzed into this aux right here. And I have a reverb on it, a big reverb. So all flat, it sounds like this. That's a lot of plugins. So flat.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
Those backgrounds are actually from the original demo that they did in Durban. I like them. Why redo something that's great? So I cleaned them up by using a little EQ to high pass it. There you go.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
And then I made them cloudy by adding a big reverb, 8 seconds.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
Fills the holes in between the syllables. Then soften them with a studer.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
Again, these were probably brushstrokes. Maybe I did the reverb and then I went back to do something else and it was too bright, so I added the studer and then it didn't work. So I said, but I like the studer, so I'm going to modify that by high passing further.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
So that by itself is atrociously bright, but that's okay in the track. If I play the same thing without this EQ, look what happens. It clouds the bottom and makes a mess. We don't want this. So I'm going to keep that EQ. And then a little bit of David Lock for bite. So this is without the David Lock.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
With.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
So in this particular case, I'm obviously looking for that thing, that bite, that aggressive, and those artificial sounding breaths. Check it out. Without.
Oh, if I only.
Everything feels medium-y and cardboardy and compressed and ugly, and that's the point.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
Okay, then a little bit of reverb because you can't have too much reverb.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
So there's the reverb that I put on the aux to create the cloud, and then there's this reverb, which is a 140, this one right here, that I use as a tail on all the background vocals. The second aux here says background reverb 2. It's a lie. It's a pitch thing that I'm doing with this Waves plugin. And what it's doing, let me cut the reverb so you can hear what it's doing.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
Without.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
So it's basically the same signal pitched off a little bit, 6 cents to the left and minus 6 cents to the right, and put back with the original signal. So it gives this otherworldly kind of chorusy, but not really chorusy kind of vibe. That is an old trick you used to be able to do with an SPX 90 called Ensemble, if I remember well. Then a delay.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
So all those effects create with the reverb this.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
But what about transition? Check it out.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
It just sits there. However, I decided to do a delay throw. So I have this delay sound right here that I automated, as you can see here. So it's no delay, no delay, no delay. And then when you get to this spot here, it just sends all the signal from the bus into this other delay that I set up on this track called FX delay. And the first thing I have on that delay is an MXR flanger phaser thingier. Check it out.
If I only knew.
So on just the word new, I'm going to add an effect. So I'm making it weird with the phaser, then I'm putting a delay on it.
If I only knew.
So now the word new is going to lay over the transition. And then since I just can't help myself, I also have Pan Man, which is going to make the effect go like this. It sounds like this.
If I only knew.
And in the sauce,
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
by the way, in this case, if you want a longer transition, just lengthen the delay. You hear more repeats, a little louder. Here you go.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
You could even be obnoxious. Not that I would ever be obnoxious.
Oh, if I only knew. Oh, if I only knew.
That was was obnoxious. Let's put it back to where it was before. There's a reason why it was there in the first place. Speaking of vocal effects, let me show you something else. We haven't heard the bridge yet. Let's listen to the bridge.
Oh, if I only knew. 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 You only listen with your eyes, so I show you every time. I have to show you every time. You only hear it with your eyes, so I show you with the sign. I have to show you with the sign, with the sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if it came like thunderstorm rain. Oh, baby, if I knew just.
That is a really great bridge. Let's listen to just the vocals on that broken down chorus at the end there. It's kind of cool. Check it out.
With the sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if it came like thunderstorm rain. Oh,
We'll talk about the vocal sound after, but right now let's talk about this part here. With the lead, it goes like this.
the sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if it came.
Pretty cool, right? So you have the sound come before the sound, and it's reversed. But it's not really reversed. What I'm doing here is I'm using the built-in, trusty, Avid nonlinear reverb. The track sounds like this, raw.
Oh, and if I knew the words to say.
Slightly aggressive and compressed and distorted. I'm running it through the reverse setting on this reverb. And I took that whole clip and moved it forward so that the direct sound without the reverb is early before the actual real chorus.
The sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say.
It sounds like you're having a headache. But with the reverb on it, the two of them together sound like this.
The sign. Oh, and if I knew the words.
Which is pretty cool, but messy. So then I compressed, then I EQ'd it because this gave me a headache. It sounds like this.
The sign. Oh, and if I knew.
So I removed the bottom and the highs as to not hurt my feelings. And then I used a built-in digi compressor and I used a key. So the main track, the lead vocal, has an aux that goes to a key, which is just a bus. And I'm feeding that to the effect track. The purpose of that is that whenever the real track is playing, the reverse track is getting compressed. So the reverse track is never going to cloud the real track. Whenever the real track is playing, the reverse track is getting compressed. And then whenever the real track is not playing, then the reverse track is going to come up. Playing with the release and the attack on this, I'm able to do this play between the two tracks, and it sounds like this.
With the sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
And that is probably why I keyed it. So you hear it come in between the direct lines. You can hear that reverse coming. The one place where it's different is I actually chose to automate the reverse off here in the bigger hole because it was just too much and it made no sense lyrically. But this is a fun effect that's easy to do that you haven't heard many times. Check it out in the track.
Hear it with your eyes, so I show you with the sign. I have to show you with the sign, with the sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
Without,
Hear it with your eyes, so I show you with the sign. I have to show you with the sign, with the sign. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear?
Not as much fun and not as good a transition. Check it out.
Hear it with your eyes, so I show you with the sun. I have to show you with the sun, with the sun. Oh, and if I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if it can't.
Fun. Let's look at the lead vocal. As a reminder, we tracked it in Paris like this.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again.
That's a great recording. I'm removing stuff. We shouldn't look at this in the absolute. We should look at it in context. All of this is done in context because the vocal by itself sounds great, but in the mess, it probably overwhelms some of the part. And since it's a puzzle, remember the puzzle thing? It has to fit in this little hole right there. So I'm removing some stuff that's probably in the way in the track.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again, make them wild as fire.
Makes no sense by itself, but I'm sure it does with the rest of the plugins.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again.
She's so good, almost no compression because she's super controlled. So there's like 2 dBs of compression, nothing to talk about. However, probably on the chorus it gets loud.
If I knew.
No, she also knows how to control that. Amazing singer. And then I'm adding a little bit of 200 for body.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
Without.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
With.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
It's subtle, but it's important. Then compression. This is mostly for tone.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again.
And then a little echo.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again, make them wild as fire.
And then a suppressor to remove that thing that's part of close miking. I'll play you the frequency I'm looking for. All right, this is the full track without the effect.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
Here on the word say thing, and then with the suppressor.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
Magical. Then I have a bunch of reverbs on it, but they're not all there all the time. So the lead verb, lead echo are there all the time.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again, make them wild as fire.
And then I have 2 hardware reverbs on this song. I'm going to make it very loud so you can hear exactly what it does. And since it's a hardware reverb and it's old, it goes.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
But it also creates that cloud that's undefinable and I haven't been able to make with the plugin. So I'll take the buzz in exchange for the nice cloud.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
I can always gate the buzz. And then there's a BX10. Sounds like this.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over.
Really nice. And then there's the key we used for the effect on the bridge. And then the long delay comes in on the chorus.
Oh, if I knew the words.
I'll show you.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
That is because when the chorus comes, there are so many tracks coming in and so much stuff going on that the vocal felt detached from it. I'll play you the whole track and you can hear the sound of the vocal without the delay and with the delay on the chorus. Check it out. So this is without delay first.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
And then with.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
Again without.
If I knew the words to say, would you?
With.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
It creates a sauce that makes it a whole with the rest of the track as opposed to being just pasted on top, which is important to me. Now, everywhere on this track, there's a second and a third vocal track. On the chorus, there's a plain double that sounds like a double,
If I knew the
where she was a little further from the microphone. Fine. But throughout the whole song, there's this.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again, make them wild as fire.
What is this? This is her vocal run through distortion. Where does it come from? It comes from another song, actually. They had done a Logic demo of another song, and they had this weird distortion effect on it, and I really loved it. So when we did the vocals in Paris and I did the track, I was like, hey, I would like that effect. So I flew this vocal into Logic Audio, used their original preset from the other song, distorted it, flew it out of Logic back into Pro Tools. And that's the sound right here. And the combination of the two is awesome because it gives the bite.
Oh, if I knew the words to say, I would say them over. I'd say them over and again, make them wild as fire. Wild as fire.
And on the chorus, it's awesome.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if they came like thunder or snow.
We actually recorded 4 backgrounds in Paris that sound like this.
If I knew the words to say, would you?
Which I'm running through the ringer, reverbs and delays and everything. And every other vocal is actually from the demo. There is no reason to not use something that's from the demo if you like the sound of it. It's not because something sounds better that it's necessarily better. Maybe sometimes the fact that it sounds a little off is beautiful. In this particular case, everything sounded good. I just liked the way it was, and it was up to par at the level of everything else we did during the production session, so we kept it. Saved time, and it saved a lot of grief recording 4 times the same part over and over and over again. So we've looked at every instrument group, and we looked at the lead vocals, and the background vocals are pretty much self-explanatory. They're just what they are. They're just sitting there drenched in reverb. Now I'd like to talk about the 2-bus processing chain. If you remember, every track goes to a stem or to a bus and then to a stem. These are our 8 stems here. And then the stems go to physical outputs of the interface, which go into the 2-bus. And the 2-bus goes into a liaison, and the liaison has some goodies inserted on it. And then the output of the liaison goes back into Pro Tools, and then we print it, and then we go to bed. However, the smarter or less tired people amongst you will have noticed there's a bunch of plugins on those stems. Oh, why are they there? Because the world is not perfect. We always set out to be perfect. We want perfect children, perfect output, perfect work. It never works out that way. So the reason why there are plugins here, well, the limiter plugins is because that's the point. The point of these stems is to be able to do micro limiting on every single stem. So if I play the track, you can see, I'm going to show you a bunch of the stems. So you can see how much limiting there is. Probably not that much on this.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway?
So you see a little bit on the bass drum stem. Here, you can see here. A little bit on the drum stem. And then nothing on the vocal stem. And nothing on the background vocal stem. And nothing on the bass stem. However, because the Oxford limiter has a sound of its own, if I bypass all these plugins, you will hear a different sound. It's a little fatter with the limiter. Maybe we should do it. Let me move them all to one insert and turn the stem group on. And I'm going to modify the stem group so that to make sure that the bypass of inserts is part of the thing. So if I bypass one, they all bypass. Now we can hear the difference.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if they came like thunder or snow rain. Oh, and if I
So we also have here a transient control system. The transient is the attack of the sound, and I'm using this plugin Mix Transient Control on the drum stem, on the electronic drum stem, and on the bass drum stem. This is what they sound like with and without. I'm going to mute all the other stems so we only hear those two. As you mix, as the day progresses, or the days progress, then you'll find that a lot of the stuff kind of tramples on your transients and on the attack of the track. The more tracks you add, the heavier it gets. So it's nice sometimes to be able to just get a little more of a peek through just on those percussive instruments without making them louder, just having more of the attack. So it feels louder, but it's not louder, so it doesn't ruin your balance. Using a transient modulation plugin right here is usually a good idea, and I do it very often. The other things I do sometimes is if I have several basses that all go to the stem, but are not subbed before. Remember, a track can go directly to a stem or go to a sub before it goes to a stem. If it goes to a sub, I will work on the sub. But say I have, for example, let's take an example, 2 basses that go to a sub and then some copy of the DI that's processed and they all go to the stem. Well, maybe I would want to EQ that so that the 3 of them actually are affected together. In this particular case, it looks like I did. Probably through the layers of mixing, I got to a point where, well, it was a little too fat in the 150 area compared to something else, and I cut it. And then I looked for a little bit of a shine here. So this is what it does. Without the bass EQ, notice that it's a little cloudy without the EQ, and also you don't read that thing as much. I'll play it again without first. It's just cleaner. You notice that the same thing happened to me probably on the guitars, yep, and on the keyboards. So let's listen to the track with all 3 EQs on and off. Off first. Clears up the low mids, gives it a little bit of a shine, leaves some room for the vocals. It's subtle, but it's very practical. Then, after all this mess happens, we go through the 2-bus, and then we go through the 2-bus chain. So the sound comes out of the 2-bus, gets into channel B of the liaison. And right now I have insert 4 and insert 5 activated, which means that insert 4 is my dangerous back EQ and insert 5 is my dangerous compressor, which means that the sound goes all the way here, untouched, then goes through the backs, then goes through the dangerous compressor, and then out into the 2192 back into Pro Tools. If I want to hear with just the EQ, I turn the compressor off. If I want to hear just the compressor, I turn the EQ off. If I want to hear and compare the whole 2-bus chain, I clear it, but I can recall it with one of the liaison presets. So for example, the track by itself, raw, with no processing on the 2-bus sounds like this.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if they came like thunder or snow rain. Oh, and if I knew just how, will you believe me now? Even if it was by summer heaven.
It's the sauce. It adds a little bit of magic. The settings are pretty simple. On the backs, I have a high pass at 30 to get rid of the rumble and too much accumulation at the super bottom, which I don't need and will make the track heavier and more difficult to master loud. Plus 0.5 dB at 74. Plus 2 dBs at 4.8K for shine, the 74 hertz being for the boom boom. And then low pass at 70 just because I can. So if I want to listen to the track with and without just the EQ, I can do it here, but I'm a habit of doing it here. Check it out. Without.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if they came like thunder or snow rain. Oh, and if I knew just how, will you believe?
So it provides the shine and the tightness at the bottom. It's cool. For the compressor, I'm using it just to tighten, bring everything close together. So I'm using 1.4 to 1 ratio, which is not a lot. This compressor is completely transparent. It has no sound of its own. What it does is what it's supposed to do. It's written here. Compressor. It compresses. That's all it does. So I'm able to really hear the gain reduction as opposed to the tone of the box changing my mix, which I really enjoy. So I have everything's automatic. The bass cut makes sure that the compressor doesn't see too much bass, so it doesn't overclamp on bass. The sibilance boost actually boosts the bright, annoying part of the signal so that the compressor clamps down more on that. So it's a very useful sidechain thing. Don't touch the bass too much and make sure you catch as much of the annoying stuff as possible. Then, the Smart Dyne is a 2-level detector system that's really cool and lets you keep your transients happy. And the softness is because I'm a soft kind of guy. And then the only other thing I do is play with the threshold and compensate for gain. It's really easy. So the compressor, I'll change it up here again. The compressor on and off sounds like this. Listen to the density of the track and the presence of the drums in the track.
If I knew the words to say, would you hear anyway? Even if they came like thunder or snow rain. Oh, and if I knew just how, will you believe me now? Even if it was.
It's the difference between good and definitely together. So there you have, in a nutshell, the reason why it took me several passes to get this song to sound right to my ears. Now, it's a puzzle. The pieces are ready for you to download so you can try and put it back together yourself in your own recycled word processing machine. Et voilà!